Despite the game being called Realm of the Mad God, the majority of the game's content doesn't come from the realm, it comes from dungeons. There have been a lot of changes made to the dungeons since the release of the Exalt client, so many in fact that we're going to be breaking all these changes into multiple videos. This video is part 1, where we'll talk about changes made to the dungeon system as a whole. In other videos we'll go into more specifics and talk about dungeon reworks and discuss the brand new dungeons that have been added. Many of the changes Deca has made to dungeons have been aimed at doing one of two things. First, making playing in large groups that can really only be achieved during Discord runs less efficient, and second, make running dungeons, especially common dungeons, less monotonous. The first big change Deca made was to reduce the base HP of all enemies by 25%, but to change HP scaling from linear to quadratic. In this graph, you can see the difference that this makes. In smaller groups, with fewer than 23 people, bosses have less HP than they did before, which makes them easier, obviously. While in larger groups, the boss has more HP, and even larger groups have a bigger difference. This means that for group size, bigger is not always better anymore. This chart shows the damage that needs to be done per player with the old HP scaling and the new HP scaling. The old HP scaling, the damage that needed to be dealt per player, always went down as the number of players increased. Now though, the optimal group size in terms of boss HP is actually 10 to 12 players, which is much more realistic to get while playing in realms or with your guild instead of doing discords. To go along with these HP scaling changes, the dungeon caps have been reduced across the board. Most dungeons now cap at 50 players instead of the original 85. There was also some time in between when they had reduced the cap to 65 before going further to make it 50. Capping it at 50 makes sense because doing an 85 person or even 65 person void, for example, with the new HP scaling would be a nightmare. Each of the 65 people would need to do as much damage as a 3-person void from before the update. Some dungeons have the caps even lower, most notably the Court of Oryx and Aliens dungeons that are now capped at 25, and the Heroic Abyss and UDL that are at 15. These changes to HP scaling and dungeon caps definitely accomplished Deca's goal to make smaller groups more viable, but it had another consequence that I think was probably unintended. There just isn't the same level of camaraderie between players anymore. There were obviously always some toxic players who would try and drag on people just because they thought it was funny, but the fact that having smaller groups makes bosses easier has led to a much larger part of the player base becoming more toxic toward one another. Now, you'll see a lot of people intentionally trying to parse out other players from in-game dungeons, particularly O3, by doing things like not shooting the boss or intentionally countering phases to weed other players out and help with the HP scaling. This is too bad because I think Deca did have good intentions and tried to listen to the player base with these changes, and I still do think this update has made the game better overall. I just wish it didn't have some of the side effects that came with it.